If you have been in a relationship with a narcissistic person, you probably know what it feels like to live in constant emotional tension without always having the words for it. You may have spent months or even years trying to explain yourself clearly, trying to be kinder, more patient, more understanding, hoping that if you finally said it the right way, something would shift. Instead, you were left drained, confused, and slowly disconnected from your own reality. You may have started questioning your memory, your reactions, even your character. And one of the hardest parts is this. While you were overthinking every word, they often seemed completely unbothered by the pain they caused. That imbalance alone can make a person feel powerless. But the truth is, you were not powerless. And more importantly, you were not the problem they trained you to believe you were. What you were dealing with was not a normal conflict between two imperfect people trying to work things out. It was a pattern built on control, emotional distortion, and a deep need to manage how you saw them, how you responded to them, and how much space you gave yourself. A narcissistic person may look confident, dominant, or emotionally detached. But underneath that presentation is a fragile inner structure that depends on external control. That is why certain things affect them so deeply, not because those things are cruel, but because they remove the illusions that keep their false sense of power in place. At the core of narcissistic behavior is fear. Not healthy fear that leads to reflection or humility, but fear that gets covered over with entitlement, blame, defensiveness, superiority, and emotional aggression. That is why so much of their behavior can feel contradictory. They want closeness, but they punish intimacy. They want admiration, but they resist being truly known. They want loyalty, but they break trust. They want attention, but they resent anyone who has independent needs. When you understand that their behavior is often organized around fear and control, a lot of things begin to make sense. And when you see what truly terrifies them, you also begin to understand what begins to free you. One thing that deeply terrifies a narcissistic person is losing emotional control over you. That control may not have looked obvious at first. It may have come through charm, intense attention, idealization, or the feeling that they understood you better than anyone ever had. Later, it may have shifted into criticism, withdrawal, guilt, confusion, or subtle punishments that made you feel like you always had to monitor their mood. Over time, your emotional state may have started revolving around them. Their approval lifted you. Their coldness crushed you. Their silence unsettled you. Their anger made you scramble. And once they realized they could affect you that way, the relationship stopped being about connection and started being about access. Why does this terrify them? Because emotional control gives them leverage. If they can predict your reactions, provoke your pain, or keep you chasing clarity, they stay in the dominant position. They do not need genuine intimacy when they can maintain power through your emotional attachment. That is why calm detachment changes everything. When you stop reacting the way you used to, when you stop explaining yourself endlessly, when you stop trying to force understanding out of someone committed to misunderstanding you, they often become unsettled. Not because they suddenly care deeply about your pain, but because the mechanism that gave them influence is no longer working. And for you, this is one of the biggest turning points in healing. The moment you stop letting their behavior define your internal state, their hold begins to weaken. Another thing that terrifies them is being seen clearly. Narcissistic people spend enormous energy managing perception. They want to be seen as special, innocent, superior, misunderstood, generous, desirable, or victimized, depending on what serves them in that moment. They may shift identities with different people. They may present one version of themselves in public and a completely different version in private. This is why so many survivors feel alone. The person who hurt you may have been deeply convincing to others. You might have wondered why no one else could see what you were living with. But being seen clearly is threatening to them, because their self-image depends on distortion. If someone calmly recognizes the pattern without getting pulled into it, the mask starts to slip. This does not mean confronting them dramatically or trying to expose them in ways that put you at risk. In fact, explosive confrontation often gives them more material to work with. What affects them more is your private clarity, your ability to quietly name what is happening, your refusal to absorb every false accusation, your recognition that the pattern is the point. When you stop confusing manipulation with misunderstanding, you stop offering them unlimited access to your self-doubt. That is frightening to someone who relies on your confusion to stay in control. A third thing that truly unsettles them is consistent boundaries. Not angry boundaries, not emotional ultimatums spoken in the middle of a breakdown. Consistent boundaries. This is important because narcissistic people often know how to wait out emotional reactions. They know that after enough guilt, pressure, charm, or punishment, many people return to the old pattern. So when a boundary is inconsistent, they read it as negotiable. They may push harder. They may test more. They may act confused, offended, wounded, or outraged, but the goal is often the same: to see whether your limit is real. Boundaries frighten them because boundaries introduce reality. A real boundary says, you do not get unlimited access to me just because you want it. It says, your feelings do not erase my limits. It says, I am not available for this pattern anymore. And that is difficult for a narcissistic person to tolerate because they often feel entitled to access, attention, forgiveness, and exceptions. If they are used to dominating the emotional environment, a boundary feels like a loss of position. For you, boundaries may have felt terrifying at first. You may have been conditioned to feel cruel for having needs. You may have confused self-protection with selfishness. But healthy boundaries do not create abuse. They reveal it. A person who respects you may not like every boundary, but they can tolerate it. A person who needs control often reacts as if your boundary is an attack, because to them, your independence is threatening. The fourth thing that terrifies them is accountability. Narcissistic people often do not respond to accountability the way emotionally healthy people do. A healthy person may feel shame, regret, or discomfort when they have hurt someone, but they can usually reflect, take responsibility, and repair. A narcissistic person often experiences accountability as humiliation, exposure, or annihilation of the false self. That is why even small feedback can trigger denial, rage, blame shifting, minimization, or reversal, where suddenly you are the one being accused. This is one reason the relationship may have felt impossible. You were trying to solve problems in a reality-based way, but they were often trying to avoid responsibility at any cost. You may have entered conversations wanting repair and left feeling like the offender. You may have brought up something specific they said or did, only to end up defending your tone, your timing, your memory, or your motives. That was not accidental. When accountability feels intolerable to someone, they will often reshape the conversation until the focus moves off them and back onto you. And that is exactly why calm documentation, clarity, and internal certainty matter so much. You do not need their agreement in order to know what happened. You do not need them to validate the damage before you are allowed to honor it. Accountability may terrify them, but that does not mean you have to keep living inside their version of events. One of the deepest forms of healing is accepting that some people will never give you the honest acknowledgement you deserved. Your peace cannot depend on their confession. The fifth thing that terrifies them is your indifference. Not fake indifference designed to provoke them, not emotional suppression, real indifference that grows from clarity. This is often misunderstood because many survivors think the opposite of love is hatred. But in narcissistic dynamics, hatred can still keep the bond alive. Obsession, anger, over-explaining, checking, ruminating, trying to get them to understand, trying to get them to admit the truth. All of that still centers them. Indifference is different. Indifference says, "You no longer define my value. You no longer decide whether I have a good day. You no longer occupy the center of my mind." That is terrifying to them because narcissistic dynamics run on significance. They want to matter in an exaggerated way, whether as the hero, the victim, the authority, or the unforgettable one. If you genuinely stop revolving around them, they lose psychological real estate. This is why some narcissistic people react strongly when they sense you are truly moving on. They may come back with charm, nostalgia, crisis, confusion, apologies, or renewed hostility. Not always because they want healthy connection, but because your detachment threatens the special position they believed they held in your life. For you, indifference is not coldness, it is recovery. It is what happens when your nervous system begins to understand that you do not need to stay emotionally hooked to stay safe. Another thing that truly terrifies them is when other people compare notes and the pattern becomes visible. Narcissistic people often rely on isolation, compartmentalization, and selective storytelling. Different people see different versions. One person sees the charming public face. Another sees the contempt. Another sees the neediness. Another sees the cruelty. As long as these pieces stay separate, the overall pattern stays protected. But when people begin to share observations, when inconsistencies are noticed, when repeated behavior becomes visible across contexts, the illusion becomes harder to maintain. This matters because narcissistic behavior often survives through confusion more than through strength. The less connected the truth is, the easier it is to deny. When the truth becomes coherent, their ability to rewrite reality weakens. This does not mean you need to launch campaigns or make your healing dependent on public exposure. In many cases, quiet distance is safer and wiser. But it is still important to understand why they work so hard to control the narrative. They are not just managing reputation. They are protecting a false structure that cannot tolerate too much reality at once. For you, this may explain why you felt so pressured to stay silent, to doubt your own perceptions, or to keep giving them the benefit of the doubt long after the evidence was clear. The confusion served them. Your silence protected them. Your self-doubt gave them more room. When you start trusting what you saw, what you felt, and what kept repeating, you step out of the role they assigned to you. And finally, one of the deepest things that terrifies a narcissistic person is your healing. Not your temporary strength, not your angry speech after one final argument. Your real healing, the kind that changes your standards, your self-concept, your emotional availability, and your tolerance for dysfunction. Healing is terrifying to them because it means you are no longer reachable in the same way. You are no longer easy to guilt, easy to bait, easy to confuse, easy to control through hope. You no longer see scraps of attention as love. You no longer interpret intensity as intimacy. You no longer call self-abandonment loyalty. A healed version of you is dangerous to the dynamic because a healed person sees patterns earlier. A healed person pauses before reacting. A healed person does not rush to prove goodness to someone committed to exploiting it. A healed person understands that empathy without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. And maybe most importantly, a healed person no longer needs to win against the narcissist in order to reclaim dignity. That is one of the biggest shifts of all. You stop trying to be understood by people who profit from misunderstanding you. You stop trying to earn humane treatment from someone who sees your pain as leverage. You stop trying to fix what was feeding on your effort. This is where the real empowerment begins, not in becoming hard, cold, or vengeful, but in becoming steady, in learning to sit with the discomfort of not explaining yourself to the wrong people, in learning that closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes closure is a decision. Sometimes closure is a pattern you no longer participate in. Sometimes closure is what happens when your life gets quieter and your body no longer feels under attack. You may still have moments of doubt. You may still miss who you thought they were. You may still feel grief for the future you wanted, the tenderness you offered, the years you spent trying to make it work. That grief is real. It does not mean you were wrong to leave emotionally, physically, or mentally. It means you are human. And being human in the presence of someone who used humanity as an access point can leave deep marks. So if part of you still feels shaken, that does not mean you are failing. It means healing is doing its work slowly and honestly. The truth is, the things that terrify narcissists most are not dramatic acts of revenge. It is your clarity, your boundaries, your emotional stability, your refusal to keep abandoning yourself, your ability to see the pattern without arguing with it, your willingness to let reality be reality, your healing. These things threaten the entire system because they return power to the place it always should have been, inside you. And that is the part I want you to hold on to. You do not need to become someone else to recover from this. You do not need to become cruel, detached from your feelings, or obsessed with proving what happened. You only need to come back to yourself, slowly and consistently. Back to your perception. Back to your body. Back to your right to say no. Back to your right to rest. Back to your right to stop performing emotional labor for someone who kept turning your care into a weapon against you. Peace often begins very quietly. It begins when you stop chasing, when you stop rehearsing conversations in your head, when you stop hoping that one final explanation will create a conscience where there was only control. It begins when you understand that the chaos was not proof of your weakness. It was proof of what you were surviving. And once you see that clearly,